My name is Leslie Spiro. I'm the CEO of a company called Tick42, and my computer works. So what I wanted to do was pick up on some of the points that we had in the conversation. I thought The Wizard of Oz was great. I remember a film called Zardos, which was even better, which was a kind of homage to Wizard of Oz in a kind of dark way. But I couldn't get enough pictures in from Zardos to kind of go to my talk. It is, of course, the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, so we're going to go with a kind of revolutionary picture theme rather than flying monkeys. Personally, I think flying monkeys is better, so maybe next time I do this, I'll try and pick that up. So a couple of things. Tick42 is my company. We've been called a couple of other names, dealing object technology, software design and construction. We've been around forever, and we work very closely with Reuters on their first Windows workstation, which was the first Windows workstation ever. We delivered that, and we've worked with Bloomberg. We co-founders of a derivatives trading company called EasyScreen. So we've worked in market data, financial services for a long time, and now we're very much based on still financial services, but around desktop integration, building systems, how you deliver them in the enterprise. We're steering committee members of Open Mama, so we've got a strong commitment to open source, and we've also discovered how hard it is to make money if you're a software company committed to open source. So one of our clients isn't really a client; they're a bulge bracket company using our open source RMDS Open Mama bridge with no licensing, as they're fully entitled to do. And I'm touched by their vote of confidence and terribly sad that they don't want a maintenance contract from us. So we understand that open source is not a panacea. We understand that open source for companies like ours, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're like, open source is a challenge. There are fantastic things. We want open source. We look at things and go, oh, we're not going to use that. It's called open source. It's not open source. And we realize how hard it is to make money out of that. So we're coming from that. Silos got mentioned several times today, and actually we've got a slide coming up later. Enterprise developers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your silos. So we want to get rid of silos. I did wonder whether we're now going to have a backlash and someone will start Save the Silo campaign. I think somebody said that silos were maybe a good thing, so we feel comfortable in them and secure, but in general we think they're bad. So I'm probably not going to take the full 30 minutes. I've got more than enough material to do that. But I think the idea of our lunch congealing is kind of a bit sad. So I'll try and get through and skip stuff over. So if any of the slides look interesting, then you can have a look at them when they get released. There's three things I want to cover. I mean, obviously it's always three things, unless it's 7 or 10. And the three things that I want to do are to talk about enterprise web development. Big story that we try to have is that web development is different when it's in the enterprise than when it's in for the consumer web. Obviously, if you're developing stuff for the consumer web, doesn't matter whether you're a profit or not for profit, that's one thing. But when you're using web technologies to deliver for internal enterprise customers, it's a different thing. And it's a different thing in a couple of ways. One is the way the UI works. We've got this phrase UX integration. Potentially there's different UIs. You want to have new ways of working. So that's the main thing I want to cover. And because we are a commercial organisation, surprise, surprise, we have a product that plays in that space called Glue, and I'll try not to do too much commercial mention of Glue. Some of the slides came from a Glue release, and so they do mention it. But I would say that you can tell that we're an enterprise web development company, because you'll notice this is a Dell, not a Mac, and it's running Windows and not in a VM. So I would say that proves my credentials. So these two things about enterprise web development, I could be saying to anybody who really is interested in web development, but this is a Symphony gathering. And we have a very, very specific view of Symphony. That we think that Symphony as a tool for people to chat, we understand why that's important. We use chat in our company all the time. We like it so much that we have 3 or 4 chat techniques, and we understand the motivations for launching it and how important it is to Symphony. And we think it's kind of, from our point of view, we're not that interested in people talking to each other. Not what we do. What we think is Symphony represents a possibility for having chat between applications. So we're going to talk about how in the enterprise web development, we think that this kind of breaking down borders between applications, sometimes called application interop, is incredibly useful, and it changes the way you think about your user, changes the way your dev teams work, and that's primarily my pitch, and I could play that anywhere. But the Symphony thing is that we think that there's an opportunity to use Symphony to extend this application interop so that user 1 can go to user 2 in a completely different organization, and make use of the fact that Symphony provides fantastic security for the message, user authentication, and the ability to have audited and therefore tradable messages. So I'm old enough to remember when we were working with Reuters, delivering their PTW, there was a product called Dealing 2000. And back in October, when we also won one of the categories in the hackathon, we delivered Dealing 2000 over Symphony. So the idea is I could put out an RFQ from an Excel spreadsheet, and people could reply either in structured chat or auto-quoting spreadsheet. And we think that's a really interesting use case. And the latest versions of Symphony contain the API that we need to do that. And so that's something that we're really looking forward to. That's not particularly to do with enterprise web development, but very much for us, Symphony chat is for applications, not just for people. That's kind of the message. So I'll say it again at the end just to make sure you catch it. Interrupt me if you want, but I'll just say that lunch is waiting. So and I'm around all day and happy to kind of talk about this stuff because I kind of find it quite interesting. So TIC42 is a UK Bulgarian software company. Here's some of our developers in Bulgaria. So we're not an enterprise. Many of these people wouldn't be allowed physically on site in an enterprise. I used to, although they are obviously allowed in virtually, I used to do development. I was a really great developer. I often think many of our company's problems would go away if I just got back to coding, but apparently anyway, I don't code now, I haven't coded for 5 years. So let's talk about the web. And I've got these kind of great slides I really enjoy, but I haven't got time to run through all of them, about what is the web. And this is all talking to the idea that enterprise web development is different. So there's this idea that we all know what the web is. Web is a chance for some of you to make $4 billion before you're 30. For those of us over 30, $4 billion would be kind of nice. Let me do this one thing, sorry. I know I shouldn't do this, but there's one bit I really like on it, please. And so also if we go to a party, people say, what do we do? You mention your app. It's on the consumer, the public web. People know what it is, and that's great and very cool. And that's what the internet is. And that's what web development is. And in my more developer-oriented presentations, I make the point that this is, of course, bullshit, because if you think that web development is about, this works better in Bulgaria because it's a Bulgarian lottery screenshot. Consumer web is about buying a lottery ticket. Most apps aren't used. Most people don't make $4 billion. Overwhelming majority of people don't even make $100 million. So that's not really what it's about. And the other bit is to say, yeah, it worked better before. The other bit to say is that from my point of view, talking about the consumer web is not relevant because we write software for the enterprise. And when I did this pitch to web developers, I had this whole story about how weird the enterprise is. For many of you, all of you, I'm sure, well, most of you, you'll know how weird the enterprise is. We run Windows, why? Not macOS, whatever. We don't use Google Docs. We use Outlook, Word, and Excel. And for the web, most of our users use Internet Explorer version 8. And then this is my favorite little bit, because this is it's a great shame that didn't work. This is a television clip from when I was a kid, and I'll tell you about what it is, but this is aliens laughing at the primitive life forms on Earth using Internet Explorer 8. Smash? It is Smash. And so it's always stayed with me. Anyway, not relevant. So we know that the enterprise is different. And sometimes, that's going to say something else. Sometimes, and this is worth pointing out, maybe less so to you, that we don't use Google stuff because actually we think that Google could be a bit evil, actually. There's people who said, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And maybe kind of Google is this company that would do anything, like put up with Chinese censorship, just to increase their profit. Who knows how much enough money is? I mean, clearly Google don't. And so this kind of makes a noise that goes, what? And then Big Lebowski, kind of pick up my film imagery. Great film if you haven't seen it. So the enterprise is very different to the consumer web. And we kind of all think, those of us writing HTML5, JavaScript applications, because we kind of benefit from the tool set that our rich consumer web overlords have delivered to us, we think that we're doing the same thing that they are. But actually that's rubbish, because if we're talking about what stuff is like in the enterprise, the differences are huge. So as I said to people in this web development conference, when you're actually working in the enterprise, most people get to sit next to people they know. You don't have to buy a coffee to get somewhere to sit. You're actually getting people who are doing kind of the same tasks every day, and also you kind of know them. I mean, depending on, even in our large banks, and one of our clients, largest financial institution I think around, but when you get down to the bit where you're delivering in your particular siloed bit of the business, your users often have a name, and if they don't, you'll know the person who leads them, who runs them. And so actually, you know who they are, you kind of know what they're doing most of the day. And they know you. If you do something stupid, they can phone you up and complain. Whereas, obviously in the consumer web, your user base is huge. I mean, your users really aren't people. They're just kind of an abstraction, a clickstream count or something. And you kind of 15 minutes of fame a day, maybe you're going to get your 100 million. It's a very, very different environment. And so this was a whole anthropology thing, which I'm going to skip past. And so we often think that I think in the enterprise web development are a bit seduced by the glamour of Facebook and Google. I think that we're also overwhelmed by the quality of software that they release for us to use free of charge. There used to be a market for producing software components. There were .NET grids and stuff like that. There's the kind of the best known Bulgarian software company. There's a company called Telerik, and they had a product called Kendo. They used to sell it as a grid for .NET components. That business has just disappeared because there's so much fantastic open source stuff. And so we use that, and we kind of think, oh, we're just like Google. We're going to do continuous deployment. We're just like Facebook. We're going to do DevOps, and actually we're not. There are legal constraints. The value of a screw-up on one of our deployments is orders of magnitude more than the value of a screw-up on, my Facebook news feed shows something not relevant to me. It doesn't cost Facebook that much money. I screw up a trade, it costs me tens, hundreds of millions or whatever. So, we're not actually consumer web development companies, even though, I'm clearly every large investment company has consumer web developers doing client-facing apps, but I'm not talking about that. Those of us who are using web tools to deliver to our internal users, we're not consumer web companies. We're not going to make $100 million. And actually, there's no reason why we should think like them. And so the main story I want to have about why enterprise web development is different is to say that we have this idea that web development must be this particular way because that's how the consumer web companies have delivered it. And so I have this kind of view about the sandbox, and the sandbox is absolutely central to browsing the public web. Yeah, I'm going to skip on a couple of slides. This was a plug for Glue 42. There's a whole demo around here about making your users happy. I think that that's something we should embrace, whether you do it by committing to Glue or not. And that was a great quote that came in. If I'm doing my talk according to my track, then this would have been a great thing about that's not right, that's not even wrong. And the thing that I want to talk about through that slide is that we just get used to the idea that our web browser has a sandbox, and our sandbox means that, we can talk to a developer and they can say, yeah, I've got my users, and my users are running my app, and they're seeing my data, and that's what the world's like. And they kind of have that world view because they're living in a technical architecture dominated by the sandbox that says, a browser window, you need to be really careful about what it has access to. Because of the web is a dangerous place, and there's lots of material that you have to worry about phishing, you have to worry about malware, SQL injection. But actually, in the enterprise, that's just not true. I mean, our users, we had someone from Black Duck, our users are accessing applications from our intranet, and that stuff's gone through scanning, it's gone through various forms of testing. There are security people involved who may or may not take responsibility if there's a security breach. And so the things that the sandbox is there to do to protect you against are just not required for accessing internal systems. And so, but we've so internalized this idea that we're writing for the consumer web that we kind of don't even notice it. And so that's where this idea of this quote about it's not right, it's not even wrong, we know what our user is doing, and we just convince ourselves that there's nothing we can do to kind of take notice of that wider UX spectrum. And that's the piece that I really want to talk about first. So I'm going to do a really quick demo, but it's incredibly quick. And so, but let me just make this point, which is that here we've got some application and it's a user portfolio thing, and I can type in here and I've got Vernon, and we've all seen apps like this, a single page web app, and it'll do something, and we think that that's the way that you should deliver your UI to the user, because it's my user running my app, looking at my data. And of course that's just rubbish. Why has the user gone to this application, and why is he searching for Vernon? So, probably he received an email or something from Vernon, but we've so embraced this idea that we're a web app and we can't know anything that's going on outside of our web app because of the sandbox, that we think this is an adequate user experience, that the user has to type in or copy and paste a name. Whereas there's lots of technologies, TIC42 has one, Electron has one, lots of people have desktop interop. So what I'm showing you here is not only a pitch for our product, but also this idea that we need to start expanding our vision so that we realize we're not delivering consumer web applications. Here I get an email from Vernon, and I want to go and show his portfolio. And so now I do a restricted view of his portfolio, and that is actually accepting that my user is a real person doing work. And in fact, he's not my user. He's a user. He spends most of his time in Outlook or Excel unless he's a trader. And actually, I've convinced myself, because I'm working on the consumer web, that there's nothing I can do about that wider UX. And so the strong statement we want to make is that as developers delivering to enterprise users, you should broaden the scope of what you're actually thinking about doing. And we have a tool that does that. It's not the only tool that does that. And so that is the first bit of the three things I wanted to get across. The demo goes on, and I show the web browser working with Excel, and it shows that thing like real-time exchange of data. I'm not going to do that because I promised I wouldn't do any product pushing, so actually I lied. But this idea, this is going to drag me off.
That's how you make transparency interesting.
But you see, because I said I lied, everything. So this idea that they're your user running your application, that's where this slide came in from. Pauli, that's not right. In fact, it's not even wrong. You know, it's so misinformed, it's not even wrong. So I've come through some of this stuff, and I'm going to drop through. This is a slide from a film called Brazil, which shows about the idea that we're constrained by what we can imagine by the kind of facades that we have, we internalize. Yeah, use glue that uses happy. That's another pitch. That was meant to be subliminal, right? I just kind of click by and you go, oh wow, I should use glue, my users are happier. So we have a phrase called UX integration, which talks about this idea that you should try and consider what your users are doing because they're not public web users. You kind of know what they're doing, the set of apps they have is certainly less that they're using on a day-to-day basis, you know, is in the tens. And most of the time it's Excel and Outlook unless they're a trader. In which case, Icon or Bloomberg or whatever. But, oh, there it came again. So this is a slide deck that I really like. So you're going to have to watch it. I want to talk about this idea that in addition to, yeah, I shouldn't have come up with this earlier. So one bit I wanted to talk about was UX integration. The second piece was how this UX integration, or this componentized stuff, can have a change to the way we work. So the other concept that we're pitching is that you should deliver componentized software. And there are lots of, everybody thinks componentized software is a good thing, right? You have more code reuse, better testability and stuff like that. And microservices is another buzzword for it. We have a view that says componentized delivery on the desktop, you know, the kind of unit of reuse should be the window, and we think it's great. But I just wanted, this slide deck, which I'm going to rush through, looks at this idea of componentized software and kind of pervasive computing by comparing it to the history of aviation, because there's some great pictures here. So, you know, people can have a vision about man should fly, and they can be completely wrong about how that should be achieved. And so remote procedure calls do not really, going back even before my time, do not really lead to code reuse, and in fact aren't particularly useful. And just with code pervasive computing, you can have a vision that it's a thing, but you assume it's in the form of a robot, so the vision is there, but the turns out to be completely wrong. And then, you know, you start to go on the right path, and heavy use of pun intended. And then you had Sun, again, slightly before my time, the network is the computer, and then you kind of go, oh, we're starting to go flying. And this is my favorite stuff for those of my age who can remember Microsoft launching Ole. Massive pitch for code reuse, incredibly ambitious, and never worked. And there were crashes. I mean, Ole ran, and they did some fantastic demos. Never, ever, ever worked. Although, funnily enough, bits of it were very impressive. I was looking at the FactSet terminal the other day, and that's the only time I've ever seen some of the early Ole have an updated embedding image. That's the only time I've ever seen it running. So, you know, I respect kind of kudos to FactSet. But, you know, there lots of people fail, and so no one here from IBM, but IBM and Apple used to fail occasionally when it did things. They had a code reuse system called OpenDoc, which was a complete crash, plane crash. But then you kind of learn the lessons and you discover that code reuse, less is more. What you want is the basic idea to kind of be able to use components sensibly, and so out of Ole, you get these dominant designs, 747 for international travel, and COM as the mechanism by which you can work with components. And COM, you know, in the early 90s unleashed this whole stage, this whole kind of wave of development. You had these desktop developers who'd sit next to the traders and do little bits of programming to tie together components from different things, primarily Excel and Reuters, data, but lots of other little bits and pieces. And so, you know, our point is that code reuse should be at the level, a kind of simple level, and that you end up with a dominant design that comes in, and then it was useful. And 20 years later, we and Tick42 are still big producers of com because we're kind of committed to Outlook. And then this great quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And when I looked at the wiki entry for this, it's a fascinating wiki entry. Because the line this story comes from the book sounds incredibly dark, and then there was a court case with Woody Allen. So if you're kind of bored and you want to wiki something interesting, look at that. And so in the 21st century, everything's going to be great, and glue is going to be the universal scripting, and so that's what we wanted to push. But when you go for this idea that you're going to have code reuse, whether it's with glue or it's with something else, it can start to change the way that we deliver. You organize your dev teams. So if you say that an application developer is developing, that he's got loads of windows which are scriptable, and that's the unit of code reuse that we're interested in and we recommend, then for you to deliver an application, the first thing you do is you look at the set of palettes of windows that are open and that are available, and you start to say, I'm going to use this and this, and I just have to deliver. Someone spoke about pacemaker developer having to write 2% of the code. But that's the kind of thing that you get. And then the idea is that a dev team, what do? They don't deliver their app. They kind of compose their app. So orchestration, composition, we're not the first people to kind of think of these things. We think we have a workable solution. So that a dev team is not having to write all the software. They're having to deliver some functionality. And then these silos that are disappearing, what that means is there's two things. One is you need to get your developers to understand that a dev request from another dev team should be treated as seriously as a dev request from the users. So that's a change to the way that you structure your development operations. You get rid of the silos. Which goes back to my first point about how in the enterprise web development we can change the UX and we should change the way we work. So one thing is if you go for this kind of interop thing, your users your developers have a palette of windows, but it also means that there needs to be strong governance on the messages and the formats and all that kind of stuff. And obviously looking at Symphony, we see a similar thing where this kind of OpenML, this idea that we can start to have standard descriptions for the objects that we're likely to deal with. And that's another change that we need to work. And then once you have these loosely coupled windows, you end up losing the requirement that two teams where their software is going to interwork need to deliver at the same time. And so you can start to move to a DevOps feature of front-end stuff, as long as the back-end servers stay the same, where you can roll forward and roll backward functionality to your users. And so that's another case where technology changes the way you can organize your developers, and there's other stuff. So one final slide. Is we've got this idea, strong believers in loosely coupled windows on the desktop, and we're very interested in using Symphony to extend that interaction, that interop between users. And that's why we're really we're involved in the Symphony ecosystem. We've contributed code, we're involved in some of the working groups, and that's because we want to see Symphony as a way to extend interop between users. And there's loads of use cases that we've come across in our clients where, I need to get a spreadsheet to somebody, or I better set up a secure FTP, I better kind of engage getting hosted in the DMZ, and Symphony, if I could script it, would solve all that for me. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So Jonah was saying we will look for validation, so I need to know if I'm validated, clearly not by Jonah. So hopefully, so you didn't say yeah, no thumbs up. So hopefully I covered those three things really quickly. Our lunch is, I'm actually under 30, I'm going to get out under 30 minutes. So hopefully I covered why we think enterprise web development is different to the UI, that if you go for this UX integration, loosely coupled windows working together, I can give a better user experience, and potentially with enough management input, I can start to change the way that we structure our work in the enterprise. And that the final point is that Symphony is for app-to-app comms. Chat is not just for people. Thank you very much. I talk quickly, so I've got lots to say. Thank you very much.